Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. Thank you for joining us this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsors, Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or in the comments page on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore the life and work of a towering figure in American history, the late Representative John Lewis, with our distinguished guests this evening. I'm now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. We're so glad to welcome Jon Meacham back to our Kennedy Library virtually, a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer. He is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, and The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. He is a distinguished visiting professor at Vanderbilt University, a contributing writer for the New York Times Book Review, and a fellow of the Society of American Historians. John's newest book is His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. I'm also so pleased to extend a warm welcome back to Michelle Miller, our moderator for this evening, the co-host of CBS This Morning Saturday, and a CBS News national correspondent. Her work appears regularly on the CBS Evening News, CBS This Morning, and CBS Sunday Morning. And she has appeared as a correspondent on 48 Hours. She's reported on many stories of national and international importance and has earned several prestigious journalism awards, including an Emmy Award, an Edward R. Murrow Award, a DuPont Columbia Award, and a Gracie Award. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so privileged to be here with Jon Meacham. What an incredible man you are. And where are you, John?
John Lewis is an incredible man. Alan is an incredible man. The Kennedys were incredible men. Your husband's an incredible man. I'm not really in that category. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. It is storming, and so if I seem to light up, it's not just divine inspiration. It might be lightning outside, but we live in Nashville, and which is where John Lewis got his start in many ways.
Yes, and
always excited to be at the Kennedy Library. Usually I hit the gift shop and spend outrageous amounts of money. So that's a pandemic casualty that we'll make up next time. But thank you for doing this.
Oh, absolutely. Last time I hit the gift shop, I was out of my little penny money myself. So they have a lot of good things in store for us, as they have tonight. And are you ready for this robust discussion?
As long as it's robust, I'm all for it. It's a primary election up there, right? I mean, do we have returns yet? We should be live.
No, not yet. My TV's off, John. Don't put me on the spot.
You're the news person, you know.
I know, but I'm not one of those people. It is all about you tonight, John.
Oh, sorry.
All about you. And okay, so if you're not incredible, at least you are always in the midst of incredible subjects.
I'll take
and
that.
John Lewis certainly is among the most incredible people in our lifetime, really. And I sure could have used this book about a month and a half ago because, I was sent down to the South, Georgia and Alabama, to cover the great send-off of John Lewis. And if you had asked me that this nation would pay homage to John Lewis, our congressman from the great state of Georgia, in this way, I may have paused. And I'm just curious, your reaction to a near full a week and a half of farewells.
It's a great question. I wasn't surprised. I always thought that it would be like Senator McCain or like a president dying, and to some extent more poignant because of where John Lewis came from, the odds that he had to surmount to become part of the life of the nation. He was the most compelling person I've ever been around. And because of what we do for a living, we're around charismatic people a lot. I was figuring out the other day, I've interviewed 7 of the 9 presidents of my lifetime. And none of them had the kind of quiet, persistent charisma that John Lewis did. And it was a moral force that was not a rebuke, but was a inspiration. And that's a tough combination to pull off. I realized I'd met him in November of 1992, so 28 years ago. And, you know, the currency of election nights, as you know, is if you're a politician, you stay out of sight because you're off doing important things, which you're watching TV is what you're doing. But you like to think that you're an ancient priest. And I walked into an Atlanta ballroom. You know, it was a Senate runoff in Georgia. I was a baby reporter for the Chattanooga Times, my hometown paper. And there was John and Lillian Lewis just standing there among the people. And I went up and talked to him about whether he missed the clarity of the movement. Did he miss the clear mission of taking down the signs of segregation, of getting access to the ballot box? Because at least that struggle, we're in the midst of yet another sequential battle in that longer war for justice in America. And he did, but it was married to a compelling vision that we then began an argument about that lasted until the middle of June of this year. John Lewis really believed that if you and I did the right thing, if our hearts and minds were in the right place, that we could bring about the kingdom of God on earth, the beloved community, which was a phrase of Josiah Royce's that Dr. King helped popularize and John used until the very end of his life. I don't believe that. I'm a bit more in the JFK mode, if you will, of a kind of realism about what's possible on this side of paradise. But not only did John Lewis believe it, but he was willing to die for it. And you have to sit in awe of someone who was willing to do that. And it's a kind of awe that I don't think should be distancing. He would not want us to talk about him as a saint in the sense of being in stained glass or up on a pedestal. We should put him on a pedestal, but that's just so that more people can see him. And his kind of sainthood, his sanctity, his holiness in many ways was incredibly accessible, because when he was born in segregated Troy, you were down covering it, his great-grandfather was a slave. His grandfather and his father were sharecroppers. The only white guy Lewis saw in his childhood was the mailman. When he read about the Brown decision, he was sitting on the school bus waiting for all his new white friends to show up. He didn't know about the Alabama power structure. And so it's this incredible journey that we saw play out in those amazing images from Troy to Selma to Montgomery to Washington and back to Atlanta. But I think the main thing John would want us to realize is that the journey continues.
It certainly does. The humility was so often shared with people who knew him, people who just met him on the street, that level of accessibility. I remember walking back from the March on Washington, the 50th anniversary, and looking to my right and seeing him he was just walking by himself, just no entourage, a congressman just moving along in a way and a fashion that just said, I'm just like everyone else here. You call him as important to the founding of a modern and multi-ethnic 20th and 21st century America as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Samuel Adams were to the initial creation of the Republic itself in the 18th century. I'm curious why those founding fathers won, but two, in describing that humility and describing who he was, and the fact that you have covered, so to speak, and written about all of these presidents of great stature and ascendance. Why Congressman Lewis, and this notion of how you contextualize, instead of full-scale biography, this particular framework?
Well, the three founders I mentioned there, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, all represented the articulation and implementation of an ideal order. John Lewis made it real. And I mentioned Samuel Adams, not just because I knew we'd be talking in Boston, but he was, the Sons of Liberty, where it was an early protest movement. Madison was about the mechanics of the Republic, and Jefferson was about articulating the big picture. John Lewis did all three of those things in the early 1960s. And, we're in the midst of a great debate historically about, should we date the founding of the country from 1619 and Jamestown, the beginning of representative government, and the arrival in September this month in 1619 of the White Lion, which was the Dutch slave ship that brought the first enslaved people to North America? Should we date it from to 1776, which is the traditional one, 1787? I guess because of Boston, we should say the 1760s too. They get very angry. 1865 and Appomattox. My argument is that the country we're sitting in tonight, on the 1st of September 2020, can be traced to 1964-65, because the polity in which we dwell did not exist before that year. The first presidential election that was unfolded without American apartheid was 1968. So leave that out there for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So until 50 years ago, there was a system of apartheid that blocked people from the ballot box. So we've only been doing this for half a century. And we're only doing it now because John Lewis and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and James Bevel and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Ella Baker and Septima Clark and innumerable others whose names don't trip as quickly off the tongue said no, that all men are created equal means all. And that energy, that moral energy and religiously inspired energy in many ways, attracted the attention, not least of John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Robert Francis Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And that dialectic is how American history unfolds. It's when the voices of the powerless intersect with the interests and conscience of those in power. And so I wanted to tell the story of the 1950s and the 1960s because that was the inflection point. And it turned the page. There are more pages to turn. I want to quickly say that. There are a lot more pages to turn. Seeing that every hour in this country. But we are better equipped today than we would have been 60 years ago to make the right kind of changes, the right kind of progress. And so John loved telling the old story, not to attract attention to himself, but to remind people that change could come. And he said, actually, you covered it, in 2013, standing in that sacred place in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which, by the way, was at the Lincoln Memorial because John Kennedy thought that having the marchers facing the Capitol would alienate Congress, who were considering the Civil Rights Bill that he had proposed on June 11th, 1963. So they flipped it, moved it down the mall. Robert Kennedy put two advanced men inside the memorial with the power to cut the microphones, and they were going to play, if John Lewis went off script and started calling for revolution, They were going to play Mahalia Jackson. He's got the whole world in his hands, blasting through the loudspeakers. This is all the day before yesterday. But what's the common denominator? The common denominator is John Robert Lewis.
What a guy to have been considered such a rebel when you think of him in today's terms, and still have had. I mean, God, there's so much I want to say here. Sometimes I get lost in my own thoughts, John, because his life had so many transitions. I mean, almost juxtapositions. You think about, this child who came of age, during, the 50s, in the sense, as you say, of finding who he was in Nashville, Tennessee. So much of your book gives voice to those folks who are lesser known, which what John Lewis always did was to give credit and give voice to people who were part of the movement, who didn't get the access, who didn't get the voice or the microphone. And I always say was one of those feminists at a time when, I'm not feminist, but certainly was a supporter of a woman's voice at a time when many of his compadres were not. So talk about who the key players in your book, why you signaled lifting their voices up through his.
Well, so John is born in February of 1940. In the months he was born, there was the lynching of a man named Jesse Thornton, about 30 miles away, for committing the crime of failing to refer to a white police officer as Mr. So he ended up in a swamp, dead. The rape of Racy Taylor, gang raped by 5 or 6 white men who were acquitted, but she had the immense bravery to speak up and press the case. And one of the reasons we know about that case is because it was in a little town in Alabama, about 50 miles from Troy, and about 40 miles away from Montgomery. And then Montgomery NAACP sent a young woman named Rosa Parks over to be their investigator. So this is the universe, right? It is white sanctioned totalitarian violence. And I am a white male Southerner. So I grew up here. My family's been here for a long time. I say that with just, if we aren't honest about this, we're not going to do what we need to do. And so this was a system of apartheid. And one of the things that's amazing about John is he had an innate revulsion against it. One of the things I found in this, and one of the things we talked about, and it made him a little uncomfortable, but that's all right, was how biblical his life is when you look at it. So for one thing, he was not John Lewis when he was growing up. He was Robert Lewis, or Bob. His family called him Robert or Bob. He didn't become John until he came to Nashville in the late 1950s to go to seminary and join the movement. And there's a biblical tradition, Abraham, Elijah, Peter, of receiving a different name when you receive a new commission of work. He went to the mountaintop. There's the seminary where he went to school, not 10 miles from where I'm sitting, is called the Holy Hill. This is pretty little hilltop overlooking the Cumberland River. He went to the mountain to receive his commission. He had a period of exile when he lost the chairmanship of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1966 to Stokely Carmichael, because John was seen even then as out of fashion, as a little too conservative. The nonviolence was seen as a kind of Sunday school piety. Dr. King and Lewis were viewed by many people within the movement as a little fuddy-duddy, a little too establishmentarian. The big six, Whitney Young and Roy Wilkins and Dr. King, and they were all seen as the Philip Randolph. They were all seen as the establishment who were not in tune with the demands of the younger folks. Any of this sound familiar? You know, as Mark Twain once said, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. His family was not enthusiastic in the early days about his activism because their lives were at risk. He had 8 brothers and sisters. His father had a job driving a school bus. His mother had jobs around town. Given the prevalence of Klan violence, organized and unorganized, their lives were at risk because of what he was doing. And there was tension there. And then, of course, the classic example is he proposed himself by his actions for martyrdom again and again and again. And one of the things, you know, we've seen all the images. Folks in your business did an amazing job during the movement of the electronic media was terrific. Those images helped change the world. I think he was in more danger when we couldn't see him. He was arrested 40 times in my part of the world. And let me tell you, not everybody got out of those jail cells. There were a lot of escape attempts. There were a lot of prisoner on prisoner episodes. So he goes into someplace like Parchman, which was the worst place on earth. It was the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Faulkner called it Destination Doom. And that was another biblical thing, though. There's Paul, there's Silas, there they are in prison. You know, the Nebuchadnezzar story, you know, Daniel. So it's just, again and again, his life tracks this remarkable narrative of exile, imprisonment, captivity, and deliverance. The difference is his acts of deliverance were not simply for himself, but for all of us. And it all seems so basic now, but it wasn't basic then. President Kennedy is quoted in Arthur Schlesinger's 1,000 Days, saying, sometimes you do the right thing and you just wonder why it took you so long to do it. And Robert Kennedy said to John Lewis in the mid-60s, John, you and the students have changed my mind. Now I understand. And it took those acts of bravery and resistance and defiance to do it. And the voices I elevated were, I think, the ones, honestly, that speak to us now. One of the points of history, I believe, is not simply to study it for its own sake, but to see what light it might be able to shed on our own time. And that's a controversial thing in historical studies. But Bolingbroke, Restoration thinker, used to say, 17th century thinker, used to say that history is philosophy teaching by examples. And this is an unabashed case of a biographical sketch trying to teach us by example that 1, change is possible, 2, change is really hard, and 3, if you are a religiously inspired person, if you profess a faith in a divine order, and yet don't do much to practice it, then you're falling short of the standard you have set for yourself and the standard that John Lewis put into action.
He had a level of connectivity to people of all stripes and was still so present in understanding young people and engaging young people. And I'm curious, in the last year of his life, was prescient in understanding not only his presence, but his being present in certain moments at certain times. Where did that come from?
It came from a powerful and perennial empathetic impulse. And he also understood the media in a way that, because he was so gracious and quietly dignified, sometimes you could miss that. But he had encountered one of the tributaries was his innate revulsion against segregation. Another tributary was his religious faith. A third was that he encountered the story of the broader movement that was taking shape in the 40s, 50s through the media. So he heard Dr. King on the radio during the bus boycott. He saw the pictures of Emmett Till, who was lynched, and Emmett Till and John Lewis were about the same age. He read about Autherine Lucy, who tried to desegregate the University of Alabama early on. He read about the Little Rock Nine. He saw the pictures in the paper. He read a comic book published by the Fellowship of Reconciliation called The Montgomery Story. And it was the story of the bus boycott, which is one of the reasons he wanted to do the trilogy he did called March.
Right.
Right. And so he ends up at Comic-Con dressed, right? You've seen these pictures, dressed in his tan overcoat, with these little kids who are dressed in their tan overcoats. There's a direct line between his borrowing his grandfather, Frank Carter's newspaper, because the family couldn't afford a subscription to the Montgomery paper, but his grandfather could, so he would go over and get it. There's a direct connection between that and being at Comic-Con in the 21st century and doing these graphic novels that have introduced, untold numbers of readers to that story. And the last thing he did, as you know, is his last great public appearance was at Black Lives Matter Plaza across from the White House. That was not a coincidence. Somebody like John Lewis doesn't end up standing there by himself, and there just happens to be a photographer there.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't like a lightning strike. Like, oh, hey, there's John Lewis, let's take a picture. He understood the power of symbolism because he had used it to change the country. And it wasn't just symbolic. Whenever people say, oh, it's just a symbol, I'm reminded there's an old story about Flannery O'Connor, who was at a dinner party in New York with Mary McCarthy and others. And, O'Connor was a devout Catholic. And McCarthy and others were saying, oh, the Mass, the Eucharist is such a nice symbol. And she said, well, if it's just a symbol, then to hell with it. So that's kind of where John was. Was it symbolic to walk across the Pettus Bridge on March 7th, 1965? Yeah, but it was awfully substantive when the Alabama State Troopers and posse men unleashed the tear gas and the billy clubs and the horses. So it's this amazing story of someone who was just with us, whom I genuinely believe belongs in the company of the saints of old. And not to remove him, not to sanitize him, not to make the present feel better or make white people feel better that we found a black guy we like. It's not that. It's that here is a man, here is an American who understood what America was far better than the people who looked like me did 60 years ago. James Baldwin wrote, he was covering some of the sit-ins in Tallahassee, and he said, people keep asking, what's gotten into these students? And Baldwin wrote, America.
Yeah. There were no accidents in the movement. It was strategy, 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 along with that agitation. And
it's, the nonviolence was controversial. Black power and nonviolence, it's very complicated, and the borders are porous. Malcolm X, was shifting his views when he was murdered in 1965. He and Lewis encountered each other in Nairobi, of all places. Harry Belafonte had sent John and some other students off because he wanted them to see the emerging African nations. And my favorite telegram, I think, in American history is the one that Malcolm X sent to George Lincoln Rockwell, the American Nazi, who was driving a hate bus around the South during the Freedom Rides. And Malcolm wrote, you better deal with the nonviolent people because you're not going to want to deal with me. So it's just kind of this, I'm not saying that it was all going to come together, but I believe that the movement ultimately had more in common than the popular memory tends to think.
Yeah, no, the nostalgia lens, I call it. The clarity isn't quite. It's a little rose colored and a little fuzzy, wouldn't you say?
Right. You don't want it to be. We can't let. And the other reason I wanted to do this is I was very careful about not sentimentalizing him. I admire him extravagantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're looking for if you're looking for Kitty Kelly, keep looking. You know, keep moving. But I admire him extravagantly based on the facts of the matter. And it's a clinical fact that we live in a better country today, however imperfect we are, because this man lived. And it seems to me one of the points of biography is to tell that story, as you were just asking, to explain how this person became that person, mm-hmm. and then how that person shaped all of us.
Yeah, I have two questions, really. I mean, because you're an historian's really no different than a journalist. You're just looking back a little bit further. But one, your sourcing, your research, because the extravagance of your detail is it's clever, it's fun, there's such a romp, right? So I want to know how you got it. And then two, I mean, could I have rolled up on John Lewis and said, yo, I met you 28 years ago, and I want to keep this thing going. I mean,
he would have been much happier to see you than trust me. The second part, I don't know, honestly. He was very kind to me through the years. As we knew each other for almost 30 years. He was nice about books that I wrote. He watched me on TV, and I would get notes from him. And so I was deeply honored by all of that. And I always knew I wanted to write about him. I just thought I had another decade or so.
Wow.
Without the cancer, right? So,
yeah.
And one of the things that always fascinated me was this theological dimension. Which, there are some people who are, want to say it was a secular movement and the theology was incidental and it wasn't just a regional movement. Kinda, maybe, but not really. The question I wanted to answer was, why was he on that bridge? And when I asked him, he said, I was on that bridge because of my faith. His faith in God, his faith in America. And it was a faith that was forged in the furnace of the segregated South. Don't listen to me. Listen to him. So we talked a lot through the years. I saved everything. And then when he was diagnosed late last year, I had this twinge. Also, this is the great antidote to where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want to survive the age of the incumbent president, the way of John Lewis is probably the best way. And I was standing with my family and 1,000 other people, Speaker Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and others, Senator Harris, on the Pettus Bridge on the first Sunday in March of this year. And he was back to his college weight, basically.
Mm.
The John you saw in 2013 walking up the mall was, he used to say, that was the John of the church suppers.
Right.
Right. There was this, and that was Lillian used to, Mrs. Lewis used to poke at him about that. Like, you don't need to have quite so much dessert at the banquet.
You were pretty fit though, John. I was impressed.
Well, President Obama, hilariously, one of his last events was at a virtual town hall like this with Obama right after the George Floyd murder. And Obama said, John's tough, but John was a little dude. Sort of. So he wasn't, there was a certain solidity to him
Mm-hmm.
through the years that was not there in March.
Mm-hmm.
And he was back to where he was when he was doing it the first time. And so I was just standing there listening to him and said, you know, look, I'm very fortunate. I get to write about dead people and they don't talk back, unlike your sources. I love teaching, and I'm a big believer in the adage that to whom much is given, much is expected. And I thought I would like to tell this story right now because of where we are as a country. And you can take it or leave it, right? I'm not offering this as the last word on John Lewis or the civil rights movement. I don't think there is such a thing as the last word on subjects as important and complex as those things. I don't think there's such a thing as a definitive biography, for instance. There can be authoritative biographies, but that's different than definitive. So I called him up that week and said, I'll be very respectful of your time, but we need to talk about some things that we haven't talked about. And he was great. And so we talked. I couldn't see him because of the pandemic. So
you thought, I'm going to do this book after he was diagnosed?
Yep.
After the pandemic had started, this
Yes.
notion came to mind?
Yes.
So this book was written
Quickly.
under duress and with a lot of urgency.
Yes.
Yeah. I have to tell you,
it didn't exist in March, in February.
That's pretty incredible. I don't know how you were able to,
Well, I appreciate that, but
and I have to wait before you end that. And I have to say, with pictures I've never seen before. I mean, like some of these pictures I have never. I'm like, where did he get this stuff?
Well, show me a picture. Show us a picture. Show us a
Seen
picture.
it. Okay, there's one I want to go back to it, but like
There are beautiful.
so, there's so many. Like so I had never seen this one.
I hadn't either. That's Nashville. That's not far from where I'm sitting. That's downtown Nashville in '62, I think.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that one, and that was just like he was. And then,
by the way, he was 21 years old. 21.
I saw Daisy Bates, but I had never seen. And at the funeral, oh, what an amazing funeral this man had! To see
Jim Lawson.
See Reverend Lawson.
Yeah.
And I had never seen this picture of him. I don't know.
Being taken to jail.
Here we go.
That's Kelly Miller. Hold that up again, Michelle. The other two, Kelly Miller Smith and Diane. Go down a little bit.
Like that?
There you go. So that's Diane Nash and Kelly Miller Smith, and I would say a word about them. Those were critical figures. Ms. Nash is still with us in Chicago and very active, still fighting for justice. So John, we're all here tonight because John Lewis's mother found a brochure for the American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, Tennessee. He comes up to Nashville. He'd never been here. His roommate is Bernard Lafayette Jr., great man. And he starts going to church at Kelly Miller Smith, the minister you saw in that picture, the First Baptist Church on Capitol Hill here in Nashville. Kelly Miller Smith knows that James Lawson, a Methodist minister, son of a Methodist minister, conscientious objector during Korea, jailed during the Korean War for refusing to cooperate with the draft. Lawson then went to India. He was too late to meet Gandhi, but he met Gandhi's lieutenants. And like Howard Thurman, who I think when he was at Howard had gone over, maybe he was at BU then, and had that encounter with sort of the black encounter with the Indian independence movement. Lawson comes back and is at Oberlin and meets Martin Luther King. And King realizes that Lawson is standing here with the gospel plus Gandhi. And it's perfect. And King brilliantly says, you're what we need in the South. Lawson comes to Nashville, enrolls as a student at Vanderbilt Divinity School, from which he is expelled because he organizes the sit-ins. In one sign of redemption, there is now a James M. Lawson professor, and the James Lawson papers are all here. And Lawson goes to Kelly Miller Smith, the pastor of the First Baptist Church, and says, I want to start teaching workshops in nonviolence. And Smith says, John Lewis is ready. He felt the sting of segregation. He hears the notes of the gospel. He's ready. Lawson and Diane Nash, who had been grown up in Chicago, hadn't really encountered the kind of Jim Crow here. She's at Fisk, which is the bigger black school nearby. They start going to these Tuesday night, it would have been tonight, Tuesday night workshops at a little red brick church, Clark Memorial Methodist Church. And that's where this starts. The students you see at the sit-ins, the pictures you see at the lunch counters, the freedom rides, the march, it starts in these basements where Gandhi and Thoreau and Jesus are all being put in this philosophical cocktail shaker, if you will.
And some people were thrown out. I mean, some ideas of thought were just too drastic.
And you had to train. It wasn't just show up and integrate something. It was a very careful, disciplined movement. And it's just incredible because it happened, as I said, the day before yesterday.
Yeah. John, there's so many questions coming at me right now. So I'm going to move on to the Q&As because I'm sure there are folks have far better questions than I have, but I'm going to start with this one. What were John Lewis's thoughts on the Black Lives Matter organization? One, and how would he have responded to those who call them terrorists?
He would have, well, he did. It's not a would have. He believed very much in the sanctity of life. He believed that protests to be effective needed to be nonviolent. He would have urged that, but I don't think he would be reading people out of anything. He wasn't about reading people out of a movement. He was about trying to shape them in a way that he believed from his experience would be most effective. And so one of the things that I'm very wary of is somehow seeing John as the safe reformer, that he was sort of out of touch with the Black Power movement in the mid-'60s. He and Carmichael had a fundamental debate. John Lewis never got over losing the SNCC. But he very quickly, really from 66 to 68, saw that politics was an arena in which he could also pursue justice. So he was at the Ambassador Hotel in June of 1968 when Senator Kennedy was killed. He was in Indianapolis when Senator Kennedy eulogized Dr. King. Took Ethel and Robert Kennedy into Ebenezer in the middle of the night before King's funeral. It was only lit by candlelight, and watched them make the sign of the cross. Some people might argue he was too close to power, right? That he was whatever. Okay, but given the complexities and nuances and difficulties of history, are you really going to gainsay any possible avenue? Do you really want to foreclose any possible avenue to reform? So he was, the person who asked the question is a great question, should go watch this Obama town hall. It was from the middle of June. I'm sure it's on the Obama Foundation website. And it was John Lewis talking about Black Lives Matter with Barack Obama, who wouldn't have been president without John Lewis. And Obama said that.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, and I think about, you bring up Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis evolved and we're here talking about him, and Stokely Carmichael, I won't say didn't involve, but I mean, was still in that sort of that measure. So the question is, which, he is living the life he is living, but John Lewis continued in the vein of service, present.
Yeah. My view and look, I'm a white guy talking about these things, so take it for what it's worth. But I think you need a symphony, a cacophony, pick your metaphor. You need all voices to argue and to try to make us a better and more just country. And I don't think there was the 4th century in the Roman Empire, there was a debate over removing after it had been Christianized, removing a pagan statue to the god Victory. And somebody said, there must be more than one path to such a great truth. I think that we would do really well in this country to study the different threads of thought and action and debate and tension that had such expression in the 60s and moving forward. And the folks who want to say this is the only way, I would be very careful about that.
So what did John Lewis think of JFK?
Yeah, this is a great question. He didn't like him as much as he liked Bobby, to be clear. And I don't think President Kennedy liked John Lewis very much. I know this is heresy here, but I don't think so. And my tiny little, I don't know what John Lewis was a huge figure in John Kennedy's imagination, but a couple of things, and this is the kind of thing that people like me live for. I quoted a minute ago the remark that Robert Kennedy had said to John Lewis, "You have changed my view, now I understand." And that predates, that was in conversations and in memoir in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. On the anniversary of Dallas, some years ago, in a memorial statement, John Lewis said in a statement from his office that President Kennedy had said to him, "You have taught us, now we understand." But that's not what he said closer in time to the events. And what I think happened, and it happens to all of us, is John Lewis wanted to remember John Kennedy more warmly as the years went by. Understandably, right? And I think I think Robert Kennedy's remark in his mind got transferred to JFK. And I don't think John Kennedy ever said to him, "Now we understand." I bet it doesn't sound like him. B, it does sound like something RFK would have said.
Yeah. Refresh my recollection, so to speak.
Yeah. So I think, but he was devastated by Dallas. Watched the funeral alone in his apartment in Atlanta. After the March on Washington, Lewis described Kennedy as being very businesslike that afternoon, but he was warm. President Kennedy was warm to Dr. King because he liked the "I have a dream" line. Great speech maker to great speech maker. Lewis represented a really complicated and potentially uncontrollable force. And while President Kennedy appreciated complexity, he liked control. Right? So
power do.
Yeah. So why would you? I think the students worried him in a way that, and my God, and then we can get into J. Edgar Hoover and all that. The Kennedys' relationship with civil rights is immensely complicated.
And This is a question I'm always debating with my husband. Would Kennedy have been able to do what Johnson did? I don't know that he could have.
I don't think so either. Partly because the emotion unleashed by his nation, Johnson's extraordinary devotion to channeling that emotion in this way, which was not a foregone conclusion. I mean, it was still a 57-day filibuster for the 64 Act. And then President Johnson, in the summer of 64, refuses to seat the integrated Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, Fannie Lou Hamer and others, because he didn't want to alienate the segregated delegation. He ended up doing it anyway. They left. But he was terrified that Goldwater would carry the South. And so I think Johnson's calculation was, I just did this. Give me 6 weeks off here.
Yeah, give me a break.
I don't know. I don't know.
You don't have to answer that. That's for another discussion. Okay. I just was throwing that out there.
It's fascinating.
So, yeah, I know. I have you on the line. What can I say? So what did John Lewis wish for the new generation to do or change? And are there any current activists, Mr. Meacham, that you admire? This is coming to you too. So 2 thoughts there, 2 questions.
Yeah. I don't like to name individual folks in real time. I think there's an extraordinary amount of energy and a thirst for continuing the journey toward a more just, not just a more perfect, but a more just union. And I think that this presidential election will tell us a great deal about the efficacy and scope of that energy. John Lewis wrote an afterword for the book, and it was sort of designed to answer this question. He wanted to address environmental injustice. He wanted to address criminal injustice. He wanted to do the things that intuitively we all want to do, economic injustice. There wasn't a singular focus, which takes us back to where we started. It wasn't just integrate this, take down that sign. It was really complicated. But he believed, and Lord, I hope he's right, that the experience of what we think of as the traditional civil rights movement, that experience and that spirit could sustain us in these enduring causes. And what he would say, remember, is if you don't think America can change, come walk in my shoes. Right? So he goes from a sharecropper's, the great grandson of a slave, to being eulogized by presidents and mourned by millions in the space of 80 years. And that's not to put the temporal stuff, give it too much value, but that's a journey.
Yeah. Well, to that notion in this question, what about John Lewis, the man? Did he have a sense of humor? Did he like to relax with a beer or a glass of wine? I'm told it was chicken wings, but what do I know? What did he like to eat? What did he do for fun? And wait, there's one more. And thank you for writing about one of the most amazing people ever.
Thank you. Well, he is that. He was a great dancer. You saw that with the Happy video, right?
There are those who would disagree with you based on my research. I have my own sources.
Your own expertise. All right. Well,
what do I know?
We'll table that. He loved sports. He was a loyal Braves fan, which for those of you who know anything about baseball, that was very, very difficult to be in the 1970s. It used to be said that it was actually easier to go to Brave Stadium and get a foul ball than to go to a sporting goods store and buy one because there were no fans there. He became a Nationals fan later. I asked him right before he died, because I'd never thought to ask him what movies he loved. And his favorite movie was Gandhi. Isn't that
really?
That because Gandhi was so important to him, and then you see it.
That makes sense.
Right. He was not a big drinker. 2 beers and he was out during the movement.
Lightweight.
There's a great scene in the book. It's from Shirley MacLaine's memoir. So Shirley MacLaine is the source. So
yes,
beware. But she's at a party, I think in Atlanta, and during the movement, and she thinks that, you know, this young student leader might be, you know, making a move. And he starts dancing toward her, but he'd had that second beer, so he ended up passing out before he could get over to Shirley MacLaine. So that was probably best on all kinds of levels, ultimately. He loved cat. The other thing he did is he loved cats.
yeah,
I don't, and so it's one of the many things that separates us. But he had a number of cats and loved to take care of them down in Atlanta, and loved history. He saved everything. He's got lots of stuff.
yeah, boxes full of stuff, including keeping that trench coat dry cleaned
Right.
from the minute he was. I have to tell you, I got one more for you. I hear he was fascinated by Las Vegas casinos. Just wow.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Where were you a month ago? That's great.
Yeah.
Let me use that.
Yeah. Yeah. Where was this book a month ago? That's what I wanted to know. In case of interest for you to say at some point, someone watching on YouTube commented, Mr. Lewis at Comic-Con with a bunch of my students, transformative for all of us. And those were my students who marched at Comic-Con.
Oh, good. That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
That's
And could you please talk about how and where you write? Do you collect research, then take it to your home office? Do you set word counts a day? Like, yeah, I'm going through this process. I'm trying to put a proposal together. So any advice?
Oh, sure. I do. I write right where I'm sitting in Nashville, and let me see if I can. I'm just going to do this. The library folks are going to go crazy, but I'm going to show you a portrait of Jon. Can you see that?
Oh yes. Oh, lovely.
So a friend of mine in Nashville painted that, and the
Nice. That's
Nashville
beautiful.
Portrait Gallery just acquired it, and that's George Herbert Bush. So it's a big country.
Yes, it is.
So this is.
I love your study. This is fabulous.
So this is it, and there's President Kennedy up there. For everybody to be calm. So I write here, and yes, I have a couple of folks whom I've worked with for a long time, who help me with archival work, and then it all comes in here, and for better or for worse, I write every word.
So do you think of a subject? I mean, is there a time and then it just comes pouring out of you? I mean, like, what is your note cards? One of those not apps, but
I'm still.
Oh my God.
Still. Now I type. I can put. But I take notes, and my rule is, and this is the advice I give people, is if you're working on something, do something on it every day.
Every day.
No matter how busy you are, because it's like exercise. If you stop, it gets harder and harder to get back into it. And then when I'm writing, I like to say I have a quota, because Anthony Trollope did. Trollope wrote 46 novels. He wrote 2,000 words a day. I can't do that. If I'm really in what our friend David McCullough likes to call the spell, I can do 1,200 or so words a day.
How often does that happen?
It's all seasonal, because I'll read and sketch, but I don't know what I know or don't know until I'm writing. Right. So typing along on somebody's childhood, and you'll realize, wait a minute, that's that's 6 months where there's not an academic record. Why is that? You know, and I find that I discover flaws in logic and potential avenues of inquiry when I'm narrating as opposed to just data collecting. But that's just me.
That's just you. So I don't know. I know you were an avid watcher of CBS This Morning Saturday. I know you are.
Always.
And if you aren't, you need to start.
Always.
But last Saturday, I did a piece on Frederick Douglass, and our next questions, it was the 175th anniversary of his visit to Ireland, which we talked about transformation.
Yep.
That a lot of people point to being like sort of like the rebirth of him in his second wave. So this question is, I wonder in understanding Mr. Lewis's understanding of the media, I wonder if Mr. Lewis ever talked about Frederick Douglass, the most photographed man of the 19th century, who was so meticulous and focused on his image. He knew how to work the media of the day, for sure. He wanted the public to see a man of substance and learning and gravitas. What image did Mr. Lewis focus on? And as we talk about photography, folks at the Kennedy Library, please take a picture of me and John.
It's a great question. And
it is a great question.
Did you talk to David Blight for your piece?
I did not.
David, he's at Yale.
I did not know. I meant to, but
the problem is, I mean, David, he couldn't come to Vanderbilt because he wasn't good enough, so he went to Yale. So we're working on that. I want somebody to report that to him, please, that I said that. But he just won the prize for.
Right, I know.
Lovely man, great man. What image he did not? I'm sure he read Douglass. He was not part of the vernacular. John Lewis's vernacular was one, there was a huge amount of philosophy, but he was a man of action, right? So it was Freedom Summer. It was the Pettus, he was moving. Mm-hmm. And so that's an important point. What was his image? There were class divisions within the movement. The Morehouse guys, the
BU guys and gals, and then the guys versus the gals.
And John was part of the church group. He hadn't gone to Morehouse. He hadn't gone to Howard. He was a American Baptist guy, and was not the smoothest operator. Worried about his speaking style. I think if you look at the March on Washington videos, I think it was more effective because he sounded like a guy from Alabama at that point. And that was what he was speaking for and to, to the country. Julian Bond is hugely important in all this.
I wanted to mention him.
Yeah, I mean, Bond was the communications guy. And then, of course, they ran against each other for a congressional seat in '86 and cut each other's throats.
Why did he do that? Why? Because I remember an article by Juan Williams. I was at Howard the minute that piece came out, and I remember it was a piece on Julian Bond and the revelation to everyone else about his habit or alleged habit. And I was just, why did John Lewis, this was his friend, why did he feel it necessary to go there?
Because they were flawed, because they were sinners, because they're not perfect, because John Lewis wanted to be in Congress. Julian Bond wanted to be in Congress too.
Yeah.
Why? So they just, and it took 14, 15 years. Taylor Branch brought them back together in New Orleans at Dillard. Dillard wrote and asked Taylor if he could get them both to come down for an honorary degree, and Taylor did. And I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but probably not much.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, I was also at Howard. I interviewed Taylor Branch for his book. I feel like, whoa, full circle moment here. Full circle. It's
Full
just
circle.
like happening to me over and over again. So you finished your book pretty quickly. This next question asked, are you now ready for a well-deserved break, or are you eager to jump into your next project? As a follow-up, what might your next project be?
That's a very kind question. I've written three short books in the past couple of years, and partly because of the nature of the moment we're in. I think if Hillary Clinton were president, I wouldn't have written probably any of them. I might have done the one about John, but I wouldn't have done a book called The Soul of America a couple of years ago. So my hope is to focus in on a big presidential biography. What I'm thinking about right now is it only fell to one American that I can think of to adjudicate between two fervently held visions of identity. And that was Lincoln. And the decision he made with the Emancipation Proclamation, however limited it was, the proclamation, was a singular person deciding that one thing was right and another thing was wrong. And I'm fascinated by how aware he was of the scope and scale of that decision. Mm. And so I've been, on my own principle, I've been reading about Lincoln all afternoon. So he's on my mind.
Oh, good. Can you name others who will walk in Lewis's steps to convince maybe that's a typo, that peaceful protest is the best way to promote change?
I hope that message gets. I wouldn't presume to talk to the protesting, the communities of protesters, but I mean, look at the March on Washington in last week, right? Reverend Sharpton and Martin Luther King III and Martin Luther King's granddaughter, and I think I heard Reverend Al say that there were tens of thousands of people and no incidents. So again, it's not my place to judge the nature of protest. I can just tell you what John Lewis did and what it meant at the time.
That was the next question. So now I can go two questions from that. Did John Lewis make any big mistakes in his life? And if so, how did he recover or learn from them?
I think the big mistake was his pride was so hurt in 1966 when Carmichael beat him that he fell into a familiar narrative about nonviolence versus Black power that he carried around with him for a long time, much of the rest of his life. And I don't think that the larger cause of a more just union has been well served by King, Lewis, good, Carmichael, Black power, bad. Mm. Right. And that's really what that narrative is, right? Mm-hmm. Everything was fine until Stokely Carmichael started waving his fist. And then it all fell away. I just think that it's so much more complicated and interesting than that I think that if I could go back and, as wildly presumptuous as this is, if I could go back and say, hey, Congressman, could you do this a little differently? I think the one thing might be, could he have helped the movement into a next phase in that period? But what he would tell you is that he was just too hurt by being thrown out of his own organization.
Is there anything you wish you would have asked him that you didn't get a chance?
Now about whether he liked Vegas. So yeah.
I'll give you my source. I
have a feeling. You can try to protect your source. I have a feeling. I know. But
I'm sure you know who it is. I mean, she makes no secret of all of her sourcing.
I wish. No, honest. I don't mean to be sentimental. I wish I could just call him up and just say, "What can we do about Portland? You know, what do you think? You know, what? It's not about. They're not questions about him, but about us. And I wish that there were a healthy, you know, pre-cancer, pre-pandemic John Lewis who could step out in the wake of these terrible shootings and these white supremacists who are showing up as opportunists and taking advantage of it. And I wish that he could help clarify the questions before the country, which is a little different than wanting to ask him something specific.
Yeah, no, he always showed up. The last time I saw him was at the dedication of the Library of Congress. I was moderating a panel on that night, and he came, and it was right before he divulged the diagnosis or told us that he was diagnosed. And I remember we were backstage in the librarian's office, and he was so quiet, reserved, which is normally how he is, but there was something different about him. And I wish I had just engaged that, because that's my woulda, wisha, coulda moment, that I didn't really engage him the way I wanted to, because I felt like he was trying to reserve himself for whatever he was going to speak out. So that's mine. I'm just inferring that. What was most surprising about him for you and through writing this book and discovering so much? Was it discovery for you?
Absolutely. It was, I think the biblical themes surprised me because, I'm a terrible Christian, which is kind of redundant to some extent. I'm not a very good one, but I am. And his capacity to put faith in action is something that has dazzled me for years, decades. And so what was so interesting to me and what did surprise me is that it was a trope starting in 1975 that he was a saint. Time magazine called him a living saint in 70. And everybody joked about it and all that. But then I actually started thinking about it and looking at it and looking at what was the classical definition. What did you have to do to be sanctified? And hagiography is actually literally means the lives of the saints, writing the lives of the saints, because hagio in Greek is sacred or set apart, holy. And I think what surprised me the most is coming out of this thinking this man meets the classical definition of a saint. And James Lawson agreed with me. So I'm taking that to the bank. I got Jim Lawson. What do you got?
Except he loves Sin City.
That's right. That's fine. But that's a good point, Cheryl, because that's what I want to underscore here. Is to be a saint doesn't mean you're a savior. It just means you're a little bit better than the rest of us. It doesn't mean that he's without sin or without fault or without vice. What it means and what's so inspiring about it is here is a fallen man, a frail man, fallible, subject to pride and ego, interested in power, And yet he walks into the line of fire again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And not for himself, but for everybody else. Could there be any more important story?
Full disclosure here, because I realize I may be going down a path and people are like, who is your source? My source is the woman who introduced and matched him with his wife. So they were great friends.
Zernona Clayton. Yeah.
Zernona Clayton.
Yeah.
And that's in fact how I first met him as a little child. I remember the couple. I call them the couple.
Yep.
And Hank Aaron and Zernona and these great dinner parties that she would have. He loved people and he loved his people. Yep. He loved what his wife brought to his home and that sort of class. She was in LA. She's my homegirl, Los Angeles born. But all said, one of the questions when you think about this real life person who was like the rest of us, but better, what struck him at such a young age? As you said, he liked to preach to the chickens.
Right.
What brought him to faith in God and wanting to be a minister?
I think it was at once intuitive and enlarging. So intuitively, I think I asked him, one of my biographical tricks is I always ask someone, what's their first memory? And then what do they dream about?
Mm.
And John Lewis's first memory was of his mother's garden. He remembered a big bucket of water and how she and he loved to try to make things grow. So once again, biblical, right? It starts in the garden. So I think there was something innate there. And then think about it. If you're this little boy with a capacious imagination, the church is perfect. Because what are the themes? It's creation and fall and redemption and resurrection and exile and deliverance. And it's these amazing stories. And the music was so important. And to him, the church was this enveloping and transporting ethos.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time he was 16, he was preaching sermons to people, not just chickens. And his picture was in the paper in Montgomery, the boy preacher from Troy. One of the things I found I didn't know, the family didn't go to church every week. No one did. Because life was so difficult.
Right.
That they could really only sort of do it every 2 weeks. And that struck me. That was a revelatory detail.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to throw it out to everyone. No more questions from the audience? Going once, going twice, going 3 times? I have another question, and I'm just curious why his truth is marching on. John Lewis and the Power of Hope. Why this title?
Battle Hymn of the Republic, written by Julia Ward Howe in the Willard Hotel overnight during the Civil War. It was his favorite hymn, Lewis's. The notion is that both John Lewis's truth and God's truth marches on. Victory's never final. Progress is provisional, but on we march. And the power of hope is what got him on that bridge and put him on those buses and got him out of those jail cells. And we live in an age that tends to privilege fear over hope. And the American story is one in which the eras we tend to commemorate and the eras we should want to emulate are ones where we've reached out as opposed to pulled back in.
How about that? Well, that's the name of it. His Truth is Marching On. You are the author, Jon Meacham. The New York Times said that your book is a welcome reminder of the heroic sacrifices and remarkable achievements of those young radicals, 20th century America's greatest generation. I have so enjoyed this conversation, Jon Meacham.
Thank you. This was great.
I hope we can do this
I've
again.
learned, we've laughed, we've cried. It's perfect.
I want to come to Nashville. I'm coming.
We're ready.
We can be masked and socially distant.
We've got campaign posters, you know, like the Kennedys. We have cigars. It's perfect. The whole thing.
Thank you so much for being here with us. We want to thank the audience out there, 1,500 strong. Hopefully you stayed with us for the remainder of our conversation, but we're just so glad you tuned in. And we want to thank the Kennedy Library for hosting us and for enlightening us through these conversations.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye.